Let's jump right into this explainer. It's wild to think about, but what if there was an actual mathematical formula that could diagnose a company's true financial health before it completely flatlines? Well, there is. And it relies on a highly specific mathematical formula that literally transformed the entire financial industry. So, can math really predict a company's doom? It's a massive, high stakes question because when you've got millions of dollars and thousands of jobs on the line, credit managers and investors absolutely need more than just a gut feeling, right? They need a system, a concrete early warning predictor of corporate bankruptcy.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1, the credit risk problem.
To really get why this formula was such a game changer, we first have to look at the problem it solved. Back in the day, traditional credit assessment was honestly just chaotic. It was a highly subjective process that relied heavily on individuals generating and interpreting their own financial ratios. And you know what that means? Human bias, inconsistency, and a whole lot of guesswork. The financial world was basically desperate for a scientific, reliable mechanism to monitor potential problem loans and grade unrated ones without relying on subjective opinions. Which brings us to Section 2, Enter the Z-score. This is the historical breakthrough that brought objective science right into all that chaos. Back in 1968, Edward Altman developed a truly revolutionary financial model, specifically designed to predict the probability of bankruptcy for publicly traded manufacturing companies. But the way he conceptualized it, that's the really fascinating part. Altman didn't just look at other financial models. The Altman Z-score was actually derived from the biological sciences. Yeah, biology. In biological sciences, researchers define populations of organisms by their different characteristics. Altman took that exact same logic and applied it to the business world. He treated companies like populations of living organisms with distinct traits that dictate whether they're going to survive and multiply or perish entirely. So, to find this winning formula, Altman started with 22 different financial variables and ran them through a rigorous 4-step scientific gauntlet. Step 1. He observed statistical significance to see what each variable actually brought to the table. Step 2. He evaluated how those variables correlated with one another. Step 3. He strictly tested their predictive accuracy. And finally, Step 4. He applied his own expert judgment. This exact process successfully whittled 22 chaotic variables down to just a handful of core vital signs. Section 3. The 5 financial ratios. And this brilliantly illustrates the anatomy of the formula. We've got 5 variables here, X1 through X5, and you can really think of them as the critical organs of the company. X1 measures liquidity, making sure there's enough working capital against total assets to keep the lights on. X2 checks solvency using retained earnings. X3 represents profitability, looking at earnings before interest and taxes. X4 measures size by comparing market equity against total liabilities. And X5 looks at earnings variability by measuring sales against assets. Decades of research have proven that these specific ratios provide the absolute best predictive power. So, how do they all come together? By assigning specific mathematical weights to each of these 5 ratios, this final, infallible formula completely replaces that subjective human mechanism with a precise, calculated diagnosis. But obviously, what does that final Z number actually mean once you run the math? Let's look at Section 4, the bankruptcy zones. 1.8. Lock this number in your head. In the world of the Altman Z-score, 1.8 is the ultimate critical threshold. If a company's Z-score falls below this line, they're not just struggling, they are mathematically on life support. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how clearly the territory is mapped out. Over in the safe zone on the right, anything above a 3.0 means the company is completely safe and healthy. But drop below that 1.8 threshold on the left, and you plunge right into the distress zone, which indicates a terrifyingly high probability of bankruptcy. And right in the middle is the gray zone. That's that anxiety-inducing middle ground where a business isn't exactly safe, but hasn't totally failed yet either. Which leads us to Section 5, making the final call. So, how do we actually turn all this diagnostic data into actionable financial decisions? Well, think of the Z-score exactly like reading a medical monitor or a pressure gauge for a company's financial health. Just as a doctor prescribes an action based on a patient's blood pressure, a credit risk manager uses the needle on this gauge to determine exactly what to do next with a prospective loan or investment. Depending on where that needle lands, the subjective guesswork is entirely gone. It's replaced by three very clear scientific outcomes. If the company is sitting in the safe zone above 3.0, you accept. If they're struggling in the distress zone below 1.8, you reject the distressed company entirely. And if they land in that ambiguous gray zone, the action is KIV, keep in view. You monitor those companies carefully to make sure they don't slide backward into the distress zone.
The Altman Z-score is just such an elegant, highly structured way to look past the surface and diagnose the true internal reality of a business. It's a perfect example of how scientific principles can bring real order to financial chaos. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder as you look at the business world around you. What are your company's vital signs telling you today? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring the data.